Hello, in this video we're going to be making a stylized sci-fi barrel here, and this is going to be based on this picture right here, which is obviously a barrel from the Star Wars universe. Before I start, this is going to be a beginner tutorial, but I do want to let you know about a few things. And one of those things is that I'm going to be using mostly the marking menus. So if you see that I'm not going into the menus in Maya, that's because I'm mostly using the marking menus. And to access these, what you have to do is hold down Shift and right mouse click, and this is going to show up the marking menu. It's essentially the same menus that you see at the top bar of Maya, but this is just an easier way, in my opinion, to access all the tools. And one thing you to keep in mind is that the marking menus are context sensitive, which means that if you have an edge selected and you make the marking menu show up, the tools that show up are going to be different depending on what you have selected. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyway, so in this tutorial we're going to be making this stylized, pretty simple looking barrel. Should be pretty short and quick to make. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to make the model in UVs, and then there's going to be a second part where we're going to be doing the texture. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start by creating a cylinder, and I'm just going to scale this up a little bit more. And let's go to edge mode and then use the bevel tool. And what I'll do here is I'm going to decrease the bevel amount. Sometimes I hold down the control key when I'm using bevel. And this allows you to have more control, basically, of the amount of bevel. Let's go ahead and move this down a little bit. And obviously I'm looking at the concept, at the reference image here on the side. So I recommend you have that loaded in. And let's go ahead and select the top. And let's use an extrusion for this. And use the offset. And reduce this a little bit more. Alrighty. I think that's looking pretty good. And then I'm going to press G and then do another extrusion. And offset it a little bit as well. So there's a little bit of an angle in there. I'm going to click here for wireframe on shaded. Sometimes I like to be able to see the wireframe as I'm working on this. Let's go ahead and use the multi-cut tool, and then by holding down Control, we can add edge loops. Make sure you are clicking on an edge so that the edge loop shows up. Alright, I'm going to press Q to exit, and then let's go ahead and go to face mode, and then I'm going to extrude this out. Let's do that. And I'm just going to do this a little bit, not too much. I do want to exaggerate some of the shapes just a little bit from the actual reference. That's one thing about stylized, is that you want to exaggerate some of the shapes sometimes. And that kind of helps with the stylized look. Let's go ahead and select these edges and then add an edge loop in the middle. And then just bevel this. I'm going to add an extra detail here that's not in the reference. Just to make it just slightly more unique. So let me select a few faces here, and I'm going to be extruding this in. This is not in the reference, but I just want to make this a little bit more unique. Just add an indent here, which I think can help if you were to lift the barrel. I've seen this in real life barrels where they have a little bit of an indent. I think it helps with being able to grab them when you're moving them around. Alright, let's offset this a little bit. And I'm going to delete these edges here, because I don't want this to look like it's just a simple extrusion. I want it to look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to use Control Delete to delete these, or Control Backspace. Alrighty, so there's that. And let's look at this from far away. Sometimes you want to be able to see your model from a distance, just to see what it looks like. And this will probably be used like in a third-person type of game, where you don't really see it up close, which is why it's relatively low poly. And then here I'm going to add like a control panel on the side. I think you see this a lot, especially in Star Wars, where you see control panels on everything pretty much. And I'm going to make an extrusion here. And then another one. This one goes in a little bit. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to keep it very nice and simple. This is for the most part a really simple model, so I don't think we need to go crazy with the details. Of course, you can always do that as well, depending on the use of the model and what you're going to be using it for. I would say this would be for like a far away third-person view. Then let's go ahead and add the top. It's pretty much just going to be a cube or a rectangle. Let's move this down. So as you can see, this is pretty simple. We don't have to weld these pieces. It's simple enough that we can just have them intercepting. Enable ambient occlusion just to see what this looks like. Usually I enable that just to see some of the shapes a little bit better when you see some screen space ambient occlusion. You know, disable it just because I don't need it to be on. I'm going to bevel this edge a little bit just because I want it to be softer. These as well. Don't want to have those really bad hard edges at the top. I want to keep it somewhat soft. And then at the bottom I'm just going to add an extrusion. You know, just in case you you want to rotate the barrel and you want to see it from different angles. I think having something at the bottom, it's important as well. Alrighty, I think it's looking pretty good as far as the model. It's really simple. To press Ctrl G to group this and insert, and then just move down the pivot point by holding down the V key so that it snaps to the geometry at the bottom. And then up here I'm just going to type 0, 0, 0 so that I can move the model to the origin of the grid. It's typically better if you have your model at the top of the grid. It's just easier to manage. And then I'm going to freeze transforms, obviously, and then let's go ahead and look at our group here. I'll delete history on the object. And I think we can start to name this. This is my barrel 01. This is going to be my low poly. So I'm going to add _low at the end. And then you can be more descriptive with the names, but in this case I'm just going to use barrel for all the pieces. Doesn't have to be. You can use specific names if you want to. But I do recommend you add _low at the end and also a number to it. Right, let's close that. So I think it's looking pretty good, so I think we'll probably start to create UVs. So let's open the UV window here. And it's relatively simple, so we should be able to just apply a planar map. I do that just to reset the UVs on the model. Let's double click here. And then shift right click, and then cut. Or you can just go to cut option. And I'm going to add a cut at the bottom. This is a cylindrical shape, so we can UV it as if it's a cylinder. So that makes it pretty easy. And then I think I'm going to cut this on the side here. And I'll cut this. There's a hard edge there. Typically you want to cut your UVs where there's close to a 90-degree angle change, or where you want to have like a hard edge. You go to unfold settings here. I think the default ones should work. Let's unfold it. I'm going to go to arrange. First I like to orient my shells and then just hit the layout button. Now one thing here is for the cylindrical shape, typically you want to have these shapes be relatively straight. Number one, it's easier to pack. And number two, it's also easier if you plan to add any details through the UV window. So for example, if you're in Painter and you want to add some detail and just paint that in the UV window, it's going to make it a lot easier if your UVs are straight. than if they have, you know, a weird angle like they do right now. So here what I'll do, I'm just going to experiment a little bit. So I want these to be a bit more straight. So I'm going to cut some of these pieces out. I just want to see if this is going to work. Though I have a feeling it's not really going to give me what I'm looking for. Let's see what I get. So I want this shape to be relatively straight, like I said, just because it's going to make it easier. Number one, to pack, and number two, if you want to add details through the texture using the UV window in something like Painter. So I'm going to see if I remove these pieces, if the rest is going to be easier to make it straight. So let's see here. A lot of times when you're doing UVs, there's a lot of just experimenting to see what you get. Alright, so I'm going to have this separate now, and then let's see here, I'm just going to unfold it. Okay, so it's a lot better, it's a bit straighter, but I'm not liking the sides, especially. There's like an angle to this piece here. Right here, not really liking that. So I think that's not going to work the way I want it to. I'm just going to undo, or actually I'm just going to select that piece again and apply a planar map. Let's just redo it and unfold it again. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to make it straight the way it is right now. So let's hit straight here. And when I did that, it didn't do a very good job. It's pretty sloppy. So one thing you can do is sometimes to get something to straighten a little bit better, what I do is I cut the pieces. I cut the shell in pieces. Just makes it a lot easier. I'm going to unfold that. Okay, so that's the top. Unfold this one. And let's see here. I'm going to cut this in half. Same with this one. And orient it. And let me rotate this by 90 degrees. And now I can straighten this. As you can see, it's a lot easier to straighten pieces when you separate them. And then we can sew these back together. I always find that to be a good way to straighten UVs. And you don't, like I said, you don't 100% have to do this, but I do recommend doing it. Now when I straighten this one, some of the UVs become overlapping, so that's not necessarily what I want here. So let's see here. I'm going to set it back to 30, and I think I'm going to fix the overlapping UVs manually. So I'm going to select this edge. I'm going to scale this in so that I don't have any UVs that overlap. When you see that red color on the model, that means that you have overlapping UVs. So you just want to make sure that you don't have that. So there is going to be slightly some distortion in the UVs here because I have this, because I'm doing this manually first of all, and because I'm making it straight. So there will be slight distortion, but I think it's going to be, it just gives you cleaner UVs to work with, in my opinion at least. Like I mentioned, this is just to just have clean UVs that you can pack really well, and if you wanted to add details through the UV window, if you're in Painter, that's going to make it a lot easier. But if you want to skip this part, that's fine. You can just keep the UVs the way they were when you originally applied the unfold. It's perfectly fine as well. But like I said, I think in this case, I think it's worth it to straighten UVs. It's one of those things where you have to decide if it's worth it to you for what your needs are. and also if it's going to give you better spacing, and if it's going to make it easier for you to pack your UVs. Alright, so we're almost done here. Okay, so now I can just sew this back together. And this is looking pretty good. I'm just going to straighten this here. And I'm going to straighten this just a tiny bit. I want to make sure the UVs don't go back into overlapping mode. Just want to make sure that the outer edge is pretty straight. Alright, and here now I can sew this back with the top as well. Or I could also keep it separate. So here you can see if there's any distortion. There's a little bit in the indent sections, but I think that's fine in this case. It's not too bad that it's going to cause issues, I don't think. Alright, so now let's go ahead and sew this back together. I'm going to apply that really small straighten to it. Alrighty, so now we have a straight UV shell for the cylindrical shape. And like I said, I think this makes it a lot easier to pack. It also makes your UVs look a lot cleaner, and if you want to paint anything through the UV window, like if you were going to add like a straight line across the model, it would make it a lot easier for you to do through just going to the UV window and adding a line if you wanted to. I don't know if I'm going to be doing that through the texturing for this one, but it's always worth it to have it. Alright, so now we have UVs for everything. Let's go ahead and just lay out. And sometimes I found that my automatic layout doesn't do a very good job. So I do find myself packing things manually sometimes. And this is going to be one of those cases where I'm just going to pack this manually. So let's move this in. I always like to put everything on a corner so that I can scale everything later as well. And then here I just want to pack things in a way that use the most space. Now you will have, there will be cases where it doesn't matter how much you try, it's going to be wasted space. In that case, sometimes what I do is I scale some of the UVs up, individual objects within the object. I scale the UVs up just so that they use more space. Keep in mind that that could also could make it look like some pieces of the model are higher resolution than others. So that's something to be aware of. Or sometimes if you have a lot of wasted space, what you can do is also add more details to your model. If you can model more pieces and add them to the model, that will help you have more things that you can add to your UV as well. Or you can add another object as well that shares the same UV space. So in this case, I'm going to scale up this one and also this piece. Like I mentioned, keep in mind that doing this means that those sections of the model are going to be a bit more higher resolution than the rest of the model. So that's something to be to keep in mind when you're doing something like this, when you're scaling pieces of the model in the UV editor. But usually it's not too noticeable, and I think it's worth just not wasting space in your texture. Or like I said, you could make another model and have it share the same UV space so that you don't waste any space. I'm going to scale this up. Alrighty, so that's pretty much it for the UVs. We are done with that. So now what we can do is we're ready to export pretty much. Let's see, let's open the this window here. I'm going to duplicate the layer, and I'm pretty much just going to rename the model with _hi at the end. So make sure these have the matching names. So it's good practice to do that. Then I'm going to click here. This is a auto smooth tool that I downloaded online. I'll leave a link in the video description so you know what to do, how to use that. And then I'm just going to export this as an FBX, and these settings should be fine here. So export this. So that's my low poly. And now we can work on the high poly model, which we're not going to do too much to other than bevel a few edges. So for something like this, we don't need to take this into ZBrush unless you're planning to add, I don't know, like edge damage or sculpted details. So it's always an option if you want to take this into ZBrush. But I think in this case, the model is simple enough that we don't have to do that. We can simply do this by adding bevels in Maya. So I'm just going to bevel some of these edges. And you could add these bevels and then take it into ZBrush as well if you wanted to. If you do that, just make sure that you don't change the silhouetting of the model too much. Because if you do that, you know, it's gonna, your bake may not look too great. You want to make sure that your high poly and low poly, the silhouetting of the model doesn't change too much. So let's see here, if I bevel this section, I just want to see if this is going to look right. Okay, I think I'm going to undo and add the bevel to pretty much everything here. Let's see if this is going to work. Sometimes I like to test my bevels on a specific section just to see what it's going to look like. And if it works, I just undo and then just do it through the whole thing. So that's what I'm going to do here. Going to bevel these pieces, these edges here. And then in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to do the texture in Substance Painter. And that's pretty much going to wrap up this model. It's pretty simple. But I think it gets the point across on how you can actually make something like this, make something that doesn't require ZBrush, something that doesn't require, you know, some crazy complex geo. And obviously you can use the same techniques for something like that. The only difference is obviously you have more geometry, that's more complex, but the workflow itself is pretty much the same. So let's go ahead and soften edges on the whole thing. Alrighty, I think it looks pretty good. So this is going to be our high poly. So all I did was duplicate the low poly model and then beveled some of the edges. And let's go ahead and bevel this one. Let's see, now the shading on this one looks a little weird on the edge. So I'm going to change the geometry flow a little bit to fix that. Sometimes you find that you have to do stuff like that when you're making the high poly model. You have to change the geometry a little bit so that when you bevel it, there aren't any strange artifacting in the shading of the model. So that's what I'm going to do here. Just going to change the geometry a little bit so that when I bevel it, there's nothing weird going on. Okay, so that's better. So now let's go ahead and do the bevel. And we shouldn't have any bad geometry, I don't think. Or shading. There we go. So now the front looks smooth. There is no like hard line going through here like it did before. Alright, I think that's pretty much it for the high poly. So I think we can pretty much export this. Just copy the name. Let's go ahead and export selection. Give it the same name and export it. Alright, I'll see you in the next video.